Thank you very much. I always think there's something wrong with people that go to meetings like this in the morning. Nothing personal, but to get up in the morning and go hear some guy talk about the brain, that's really, I don't know, special people. So what I want to do to make that, give a little bit of reward to you for going out of your way to come and hear about this stuff is teach you something that I think will be helpful in your work and in your life that may seem in the beginning a little bit far afield from children and play, but I think by the end of the 45 minutes you'll have an understanding of how I'm trying to weave these things together and why actually in the end I want you to recognize that play is probably the most effective way to learn anything. And play is probably the most effective way to lead. And play is probably the most effective way to create. And play is essential to high productivity in the workplace. And play is absolutely essential to effective communication in any educational process. And play is essential to the health and welfare of our culture. But we have taken play, we misunderstand play, we misidentify play, and we have relegated play to a position in our culture that is actually quite to the detriment of so many of the things that we're trying to do as a people. So, but I don't want to just say that and have you go, that kind of resonates with what I want you to understand why. I want you to understand the mechanisms that are underneath this. I'm not just making this statement because, I like to play. Play is the way we should go. It's because there is neurobiological rationale for understanding, appreciating, and celebrating play. So let me just start with this. When you look at any human being, the human being has essentially got a bunch of physical parts to us. We've got our fingers and our hands and our arms, and we've got our body, and inside, our body are these organs, and one of the major organs inside our body is our brain, and all these things work as a seamless whole. Now we tend to think about the brain and body as separate, but they're not. The brain actually just, so just to be clear, the brain is part of the body. It's not separate. So the brain is essentially the part of your body that helps you interact with the rest of the world. And it helps you understand and control and regulate your own inner world. So in order to do that, there has to be some apparatus to, number one, perceive what's going on, sense what's going on out there, and sense what's going on in here. So your brain has all kinds of sensory apparatus. You remember the 5 senses you learned about in elementary school? But there are other senses that you have that tell you things like how much oxygen you have in your blood, how much glucose you have in your blood, tell you what your internal environment is, and the senses that you learned about in elementary school, those tell you about the external environment. Now, I'll come back and sort of elaborate on that a little bit, but I want to just give you a tiny little bit of appreciation. I'm not going to go into it like I did last night, but I'll summarize a little bit about the complexity of the brain. Your brain, now first of all, your brain is not a colored upside down triangle. This is a model. This is sort of a picture of the brain. Your brain is actually an ungodly complex mass of billions and billions of cells that are somehow working together in a dynamic way. And again, one of my favorite quotes about neuroscience and the complexity of the human brain comes from a colleague of mine at Harvard who is a wonderful neuroscientist, and he takes his graduate students when they come in and he says, listen, I just want to get a sense of how much you think we know about the brain. You know, you're aware of the fact that we have all these journals and all these meetings and we publish stuff all the time and we have all these new technologies. You know, if you consider everything there is to know about the human brain, a 1-mile journey, how far do you think we've come on that journey? And some graduate students are like, I think we've gone, you know, 400 yards, 200 yards. He says, no, we've come about 2 inches. And so let me tell you why we've only come a tiny little bit by just giving you a few facts. There are 86 billion separate neurons in your brain. There are 5 times as many glial cells, which are functionally just as important as neurons. Each neuron has between 200 and 2,000 synaptic connections, which is where they interact with and get signals from or communicate to other neurons. Each one of these synaptic boutons has something like 5 to 10,000 proteins in it that are uniquely regulated. And each one of those proteins has several genes that code for the protein or regulate the protein. And each one of these synapses is in dynamic activity. So if you take all of that into consideration, the firing rate and the number of moving parts, there's something like 2.5 trillion depolarizations in your brain every minute, which is beyond comprehension. I mean, just think about the fact that there are 7 to 8, maybe 9 billion people on the planet. Imagine trying to get 9 billion people on the planet just to do one thing at one time in synchrony. Let's say that we said, hey, let's decide that we're going to make everybody on the planet clap their hands for 30 seconds at midnight on January 1st. You'd send out the memos, and there'd be people that say, oh, that's a communist plot. And you'd have some people that say, is that Eastern time or Central time? And you'd have some people that say, I think that that's going to be the end of the world because all the reverberations of the human spirit will get together. And we couldn't do it. We probably couldn't even get our family to clap. Last night I was joking about trying to get my family to choose where we're going to go eat when we're on vacation. Think about coordinating 86 billion neurons to allow you to do thousands of different functions. You know, literally, your brain is what allows you to move your fingers and do this kind of stuff and laugh and have a daydream when you're in a boring lecture, which I know. Believe me, we'll get to that in a minute. But your brain does so many different things. And it does so many things well, and there are so many unrealized potentials in your brain. As remarkable as you are as an individual, there are some things that you didn't express in your brain that you could have. Do you speak Chinese? You don't speak Chinese? What's wrong with you? Do you play the piano? Oh. All right. How about pool? Can you play pool? All right. So think about it. Everybody, as remarkable as you are, we've got all kinds of things where there's unrealized potential. And that unrealized potential doesn't mean that you've been neglected, doesn't mean you're bad, it just means that you have, by virtue of your personal history, had a series of experiences that have provided pattern, repetitive stimulation in areas that you were exposed to. So a little child who grows up in a household where nobody's speaking to him, he won't have as elaborated a speech and language capability as a child who grows up in a household where there's lots of people speaking to him. A child who grows up in a household where there is one overwhelmed caregiver is going to have a different set of social emotional skills and strengths than a child who grows up in an extended family where there's grandmas and aunties and cousins and everybody around all the time, and he has to learn how to negotiate and how to cooperate and how to create alliances and how to do all kinds of complex social things to get along in his own little family. So, the brain, very complex. Here's one of the most useful pieces of information I'm going to tell you today. You will actually use this in your life. The way that your brain coordinates and orchestrates all of these separate parts, all these different areas of the brain, let's just do a tiny little review. I know you learned this, but I'm going to remind you. Different parts of your brain mediate and regulate different functions. So that, there are parts of your brain up here that are involved in and responsible for speech and language. And there are parts over here that are responsible for vision. And there's parts over here that are responsible for cognition, for thinking about, the future, for planning and so forth. This part of the brain, the cortex, is a part of the brain that's most uniquely human. If you take the genes and you take the physical organization and you look at all the neurobiology of your brainstem, it's very, very similar to the neurobiology of the brainstem in another primate, or even another mammal, or even a lizard. And many of you probably heard about the brainstem referred to as the lizard brain. And that's because the functions that are mediated by that part of the brain are simpler, they're more regulatory, and the structure and functioning of that part of the brain is simpler. I mean, it's not simple, it's simpler than the structure of the top part of the brain. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is that you weave together the lower, the middle, and the top parts of your brain using these unique neural networks that have the capability of communicating simultaneously with all of them at the same time. And these neural networks have their origin in lower parts of the brain, and they send connections up to every other part of the brain. They also influence and control all of the outflow to the body. So you have nerves that come out to your body called the autonomic nervous system. And you have hormones that come out from your brain that influence your organs. And all of those connecting systems, the neuroimmune system, the neuroendocrine system, the autonomic nervous system, are also controlled by these neural networks. So that means that they're very, very, very important in modulating the stress response, in modulating and regulating what we call the homeostatic mechanisms that we use to control our internal environment and to control and perceive our interactions with the external environment. They're the backbone of the stress response. And I'm going to come back and talk about this a lot in a minute. But here's one of the things I want you to know. When you look at the very same sort of model, and you look at those sensory apparatus that I talked about, all your internal sensory apparatus that tell you where you are in space, that tell you about, give you feedback about how your blood pressure is, or oxygen, all that stuff that's telling you about your internal milieu. These things don't go right up to the really smart part of your brain and say, hey, cortex. They go into the dumbest part of your brain. They go to the categorical part of your brain. They go to the part of the brain that literally is no more flexible, no smarter than a lizard. It's an interesting thing. Your internal signals basically are coming in, telling a part of your brain, an unconscious part of your brain, how things are inside, and then this part of the brain, that lower part of the brain, is basically processing that and acting on it. So, if you actually find that you have a little bit less oxygen, you may not even be aware of the fact that you'll take a deeper breath, or you'll yawn, or by the time it actually gets to the point where you are aware and you feel shortness of breath, it kicks it up to this part of your brain that says, hey, I need to sit down, I can't walk up these stairs anymore. So you have different levels of analysis, you have different levels of acting. Again, this for anybody who works, anybody who is a supervisor, anybody who's a parent, anybody who is in a relationship with another person, this is essential information, because the dumbest part of your brain gets first dibs on interpreting and acting on what's happening in this moment. This can be a big problem. This can be a huge problem. Because you may be a supervisor in a workplace, and you just happen to have certain physical attributes that remind your employee of a bully that he experienced in middle school. And he will literally misinterpret every single interaction with you and act as if you're being hostile, when in fact, you were just giving him normal supervision like you give anybody supervision. But he'll go around and say, you know, he really doesn't like me, he gives me the worst assignments, and it's all a distortion based upon his previous experiences. Now, we all carry around these precortical associations. Let me talk about what association is for a minute, because this is sort of the heart of understanding education. Because your brain has this construction that I talked about before to make sense out of the inner world and outer world, in order for you to understand the connection between things that are visual and things that are tactile, in order for me to understand that this is something you don't eat, earlier in life, when I found something like this, what did I do? The first time when I was a little baby, I touched it, I smelled it, I licked it, I chewed it, I mouthed it, I did all kinds of stuff, I got all my sensory stuff, and after a while I realized, you can't eat that. And then, any of you who's had babies, right? What's the first thing they're like, then they do that. They're literally trying to make sense out of what it is that they're interacting with. But what the cool thing is that once they have made the association between shiny objects that are sort of smooth like this, and they actually come to understand that they will look at something like this and they will know that that's a solid object, they know it's hard, without touching it. Because they've made associations, and I think I have this in here somewhere. The brain makes associations between patterns of neural activity that co-occur. And so, that used to be me. And I can't, all right, here's neurons moving, and creating an association. See that? See how they wove together like that? There is a way to drive this, and I cannot figure out how to do it. I can't do it from here. I can do it on a different, I'm going to pull up a different set of slides that I can actually manipulate a little bit easier. But what I want you to think about when you are looking at this the next time I show this to you, when you are a little child and you're exposed to a pattern of neural activity that is created by a visual stimulation, and the example I use all the time is, let's pretend that you see an animal. You are seeing a dog in your house. And that creates the photons in your retina, turn that physical energy into patterned neuronal activity that goes up into your brain. At the same time, you hear the animal bark, and that goes into a different part of your brain, and it creates a different pattern of activity. And so pretend that this is the visual one, and this is the auditory, and you see the animal, hear the bark, see the animal, hear the bark, see the animal, hear the bark, and pretty soon the bark becomes connected to the image. And we do this with everything. Now, what I've described is sort of a simple two-part association. But because life is complex and the world has multiple sensory elements, we create complex associations. And one of the most complex associations we created is the association we make about human beings. So when you're a little child, and you get hungry, thirsty, cold, and your internal signals say that you're under this is distressing, and your stress response system activates, and you have the infant's equivalent of the fight or flight response, which is crying, and you are in the presence of a loving, attuned, attentive caregiver who hears the cry and comes to respond. They put you in her arms, and they move you, rock you, and they stroke the back of your head, and they put you to her breast, and you feed, and all of a sudden the distress of being cold and hungry is relieved, and the relief of physiological distress activates a system in your brain called the reward neurobiology, and so you have a reward, you have relational signals, and you have regulation. 3 primary neural networks in your brain are woven together that make essentially the fundamental framework that will lead to a successful human being. Relationship, reward, and regulation. And what that means is you start to make associations between people and safety, between people and pleasure. And when you get a little bit older and you meet your first preschool teacher and she smiles at you, you smile back. And when you are making your little letters and you do something and she goes, good work, that's a powerful reward. And it keeps you doing whatever you were doing. And if you have that normal organization, if you have that good set of associations, guess what? You don't have to have a special behavioral program to get kids to do the right thing. Because you are present and you go, yeah, that's awesome. That's enough of a reward. They have pro-social neurobiology that allows them to be rewarded by healthy, typical human interactions. And to get pleasure from being with other people. And pleasure is the fuel of repetition. Now just remember, here's the deal. Pleasure is the fuel of repetition. And what did I just tell you about the brain? The brain develops in a use-dependent way. You want ability to learn as scales? You want to learn Chinese? You better make it fun. If it ain't fun, you ain't going to learn it. That's why relationally mediated teaching is so much more effective than non-relational mediated teaching. Because it's pleasurable. It's regulating. And why is the regulating part important? Because of this. Now, let me go back to this set of slides and show you something that is, again, it's a little neurobiology. Don't be afraid. I actually made this set of slides for people in the corporate sector who aren't neuroscientists, who are interested in learning about how to increase productivity in the workplace. And one of the things that is the most important thing to increase productivity and increase creativity is to let people have access to their cortex, right? The smartest part of your brain. It's the part of your brain that's most creative, the part of your brain that solves the best problems, part of the brain that takes things that were previously internalized and puts them together in unique ways. It's your cortex. But here's what happens. You can only get to this reflective part of your cortex if you are regulated, if you're calm. Now, there's a couple aspects to being regulated. One of the most important things about being regulated is that you're not hungry, you're not thirsty, you're not cold, you don't have a full bladder, you're not horny, you have, and I'm serious about that. It's any of those internal distractors take you away from being creative. You cannot be in this reflective state if you're in a busy environment. So like right now, here's what you guys are doing. You are externally focused on what I'm saying, but you can only be externally focused for about 10 seconds before you literally disengage from what I'm saying a little bit and attend to your inner thoughts. This is called dissociation. And you guys have been doing it all morning. I'll change the slide, you'll focus externally for a little while, and then you go back into your inner world. And you'll play with, you'll see where does this fit in my scheme of how the world works? And does this make sense? Does this sound like, can I connect this to something else I know? And then I'll change the slide, and you go, what's he doing now? And then I'll change it again. And you go, oh my God, what does this mean? This is really confusing now. If I get in an alarm state, if I get really upset and anxious, guess what? I have minimal access to my cortex, which means that if I want to put new information in your head, I'm not going to be able to do it. Fear kills learning. The acquisition of new content is almost impossible when you're in a state of tension, anxiety, fear. So, the other thing that's very interesting about this is that all functioning of the brain is state dependent, which means that if you're in this state, you're not going to be as good at any motor acquisition that you've developed, right? Any motor skill. If you start to get anxious about whether or not you're going to make the basket, guess what? You're not going to make the basket. If you start to, your social skills will erode. You know, when you are in this state like this, you're not going to be as attuned to other people. You're not going to be as reflective and responsive. You're going to be more self-absorbed. You're going to be more inappropriate. You're going to say things that are going to get you in trouble. Because the part of your brain that actually can tell time is up here. And the part of the brain that wants to tell your boss to go to hell is down here. And so without this part of the brain inhibiting this part of the brain, you know, if you have this whole set of body of knowledge that it's good to be rude to the boss, even when he's stupid. You don't tell him he's stupid. But by the time you get really frustrated by the boss, and you are in this state, guess what? You tell him that's the stupidest damn frickin' idea I've ever heard. And of course, when your job review comes up, you're hosed. This plays out in every aspect of everybody's life, every day, in one way or another, state-dependent functioning. And it is crucial to understand this in context of play. Now, why is play important? Play is important because play is an activity that allows you to activate your stress response systems. It allows you to be exposed to new things which will activate your stress response. Make no mistake about it. What your brain does, once it makes a sort of an internal representation of the world, everybody, as you grow up, you get this idea about the way the world works, and you've got all these little associations in your head, and when you see patterns of neural activity that go into your brain and get matched against previously stored stuff and it doesn't fit, guess what? Your brain goes, what is that? Your brain doesn't treat novelty like, oh, this is awesome. Your brain goes, proven bad, it's bad until proven otherwise. That's what your brain does. The default response of your brain to novelty is to activate your stress response. So how many of you have been in a meeting and the boss will come in and say, everybody's going to get a brand new computer. And people will go, oh, I don't know. You know, it's like, it's a freaking brand new computer. If you would literally, if you had your choice, you would go out and buy it. But if you went out and bought it on your own money, you'd think, this is the greatest thing ever. But when the boss comes and says, everybody's going to go to a new computer, you're like, oh, I don't know. That's like transferring my files, and I'm so used to it. Happens all the time. Novelty overwhelms some people. But see, what the key thing, the difference between you seeing, hey, there's a new computer, I'm going to go buy it, and a boss coming in and saying, you're going to use a new computer, is controllability. Anybody here who's ever worked for themselves knows that you work more hours, but you feel less stressed. Because you control it. Now, let me talk about this a little bit. These systems in your brain, you know, the systems I talked about that are involved in, you know, that orchestrating and integrating everything, they're the systems in the brain that control the stress response, basically. And so when incoming information says, hey, you're under threat, there's a challenge out there, they activate. And when they activate, they start to shut down your brain from the top down. And that's an adaptive thing, actually. You don't want to be deciding whether you should jump to the right or the left when the train is coming. You just want to jump. And it doesn't really matter, you know, the left side's kind of good, but you know, then I'll be over here, and I'm going to have to walk all the way around. You don't want to do that kind of thinking. Under threat, you want to actually act right away. And so this architecture is actually good for us, but it can get in the way if it becomes abnormally sensitized. So, what happens to these systems in your brain when you are a little child and you grow up in an environment where you don't have a lot of control and there is a significant degree of unpredictability or chaos or even overt threat, is that the baseline level of your stress response system, its reactivity, is shifted up. You become what we call sensitized. And when you're sensitized, what that means is that for a typical or expectable, unavoidable level of everyday stressor, rather than having sort of the ability to stay in the active alert state and manage whatever the challenge is, could be the challenge at school, could be a challenge at work, could be a challenge in sports, whatever it is, you still reasonably regulate it. But if you have a sensitized stress response system, you get introduced to a little bit of novelty, a little bit of stressor, you are so overwhelmed that you have no access to your cortex. In other words, what this means for education of children is that when we take away from children the opportunity to control exploration, and we tell them what to study, when to study, and how to study it, we're literally participating in a process that shuts down their cortex and makes learning much more difficult for them. And the more you come from a sensitized environment, poverty, chaos, domestic violence, abuse, whatever, the harder it's going to be to tolerate this kind of environment where people are controlling that process. So, what that means is, both for kids that are from at-risk environments, but also for kids that aren't, the best way to help them become resilient and be capable of tolerating the inevitabilities of a world telling them what to do, because it's going to happen, it's inevitable, is to help them develop resilience by giving them opportunities for resilience building experiences with stress. And the best experience building, resilience building activity like that is play. It's play. You leave your comfort zone, you see something new, you practice with it, and then you go back to your comfort zone. You control how long you play with the blocks. Remember the kids that when they're just learning how to stack blocks, they stack, and they'll fall down, and they'll do it again, and again, and again. And some kids will do it for a while, and then they'll walk away from it, and they'll come and do it again. And they dose themselves. They dose how frustrated they get, and then they walk away from it, and then they'll come back and do it again. And then they get to the point where they master it, and it's boring, because it's now internalized. Stacking blocks is no more fun. And they move on to some other task. So at the museum, for example, they have all these different activities, and what you'll find is kids are gravitating towards the things that are proximal to their development. They're close enough that they're familiar with what it is, but it's novel enough to keep them engaged. And the healthy process of learning is this: if you feel safe, you will literally choose to leave your comfort zone and explore. If you don't feel safe, you retreat back into your comfort zone, which means you're going to be harder to teach, it will be harder for you to learn. But if you create a safe environment with lots of interesting opportunities for stimulation, children will choose to leave their comfort zone. They will do something cognitive, social, motor, and they'll go back to their comfort zone. And they will literally develop resilience. Now, why is resilience important? I kind of said it earlier, but it is inevitable at some point in your life that other people are going to take control of interactions with you. It's just inevitable. Life is full of unpredictability and stressors. And if you are resilient, guess what happens? If you are resilient, you can tolerate the inevitable stressors of life, and you can end up continuing to build content into your cortex, continuing to build content into the social and emotional parts of your brain. Sensitized child who did not have play or resilience building experiences. The irony, and here's the challenge, is if you're one of these tuned up kids, and this is a little bit of a complex slide, but I just want you to get a sense of this. If you're sort of a child who had an opportunity through play and through a safe enough environment, you have a pretty well-regulated stress response capability, and you go into school, here's the first challenge. And you are activated by that challenge, but you get back to your baseline, and then there's a new challenge. And what happens is, the externally imposed challenge, because it is dosed properly for you, can make you more resilient. But if you're a child who has not had opportunities for enough play to build in this resilience capability, the exact same curricular expectations will make you more overwhelmed, and you won't master it, and by the time the teacher introduces concept number 2, you're going to be completely lost. And these kids get sensitized by traditional educational interactions. And you could take that into traditional sport interactions, traditional social interactions, traditional anything. Dosing is the key. And the beauty of play is that when you have an opportunity to be regulated and have control over the interaction, you have access to your cortex, and you have, more importantly, you have opportunity to control the emotional vehicle that becomes the glue that makes the cognitive concepts stick. One of the most important things we know about acquisition of cognitive content is that the most efficient way to teach anybody something is to have a narrative that has an emotional component. So when people are learning about, brain development, they remember the stories about that child who had A, B, and C, as opposed to the fact that there's 86 billion neurons and that most of them are present in your brain by the time you're born. They remember narrative. And the only way to have a positive, emotional, affective vehicle is to have this part of the brain available for business, and then you can get stuff efficiently stored in your cortex. Now, everybody in this room, when you think back on the teachers who were the most important in your life, they were storytellers. They could engage you. They would make you, they made you feel things. Even if they were teaching geology, they would get you excited about the content. And so there was either humor or joy or pain or sadness. These things anchor cognitive content. And again, the healthiest way to have a multisensory brain, if you will, a brain organizing set of experiences that are to you developmentally appropriate is to have an opportunity for play. Now, the other thing about play, and I'm just going to talk about this for 1 second, is that the brain develops in essentially from the bottom up and from the inside out. And let me see if I think I have a set of slides here to show this. I think I do. Yes, I do. So, the way your brain organizes is essentially like this. When you're in utero, the lower parts of the brain are actively organizing because they have to be ready when you're born. And then after you're born, those parts are kind of organized, and increasingly other parts of the brain develop. And so at any given moment, while you are organizing, there is a zone of, we call, different people call it different things, but a zone of sort of active organization. And it's different when you're a newborn than when you are 3. And it's different when you are 10. And so the interesting thing is, if you actually go back and look at the development of a child, you'll find that the nature of play shifts with where they are developmentally. And it matches perfectly what they need to organize that part of the brain in this process. And so if you really want to help facilitate efficient development of a child in all domains, motor, social, cognitive, the best way to do it is to give them opportunities for self-directed dosing of both the nature of the play, the intensity of the play, the pattern of the play, and what they will do is they will create a resilience building pattern for them. Because my dose is different than your dose. I'm at a different point developmentally than you are. And we each end up picking what fits where we are. So by the time you get to be our age, the nature of play, a lot of times it becomes cognitive, joking, right? People sort of, you know, they'll be playful in the way they interact with other people. That's play. That's bringing a form of pleasurable dosing of social interaction into the workplace, into a relationship, and it is a positive thing. All right, it's 9. Is it 9? 9? 9?
Past 9.
20 past 9. So it's time for me to stop, and it's I would be happy to, and I hope there are some opportunities for a little discussion. That was the plan, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. So there's a lot more, as you can imagine, that I could say, but I would very much like to just see if other folks have comments, thoughts, questions, dirty limericks, whatever. You know, it's a playful time. Yes.
So, how do you build resilience in a child?
Let them play.
As long as possible?
Well, that's sort of a snide. I mean, it's not that easy. Building resilience essentially is completely related to having opportunities to have moderate, controllable challenges. And so you actually, stress is what makes you resilient. It's just the pattern of stress. And so what I was trying to say is that the best way to get a resilience building pattern of stress activation for a child, or actually even an adult, is to give them opportunities to select how they want to leave their comfort zone, when they want to leave their comfort zone, what they want to do when they leave their comfort zone, and then how long they want to stay out of their comfort zone, and then they'll dose and go back. And so they're the ones who self-define what is a moderate, controllable, predictable activation. And they're the ones that know better than we do. Yeah.
Well, just to follow up on that, when we have a child, we have 3, but so our son, maybe you could shed some light on this. Our son kind of grazes and will do the things that are very comfortable for him and kind of just leave things, where my daughter, who's younger, will stay on a project and, you know, challenge herself. So we feel like he gets stressed when things are too hard for him. So I guess what I'm coming away with it as, keep it fun and just keep making it fun for him.
And what he will be able to tolerate will grow the more he builds a mastery around whatever he is doing.
Okay.
Now here's the key to all of this stuff, is that if the starting point of the process is, if you are regulated, let me just kind of, and I didn't talk about this too much, I sort of put pictures up that you might infer some of this stuff, but let me be really explicit about it. Because of the way the brain's organized, there is a sequential process by which you get content to your cortex. And so you really can't get up to this top part of your brain effectively. I mean, you can get there, but if you're trying to sort of teach somebody something or help them understand something or communicate, you can't get to this part of their brain unless you are effectively connected. And you can't really get there if they're not regulated. And even more, sort of interrelated to this, and probably just as important, is that because human beings are very contagious, if you're not regulated, your child won't be regulated. And so it's interesting how often our interactions with our kids are when we're a little frustrated and we are still in control enough of ourselves that we have some cognitive idea of what we want you to do, but the frustration, the stuff we have up here that we know is right, we want to get this into Billy's head. It's important for you to brush your teeth before you go to bed. But he's resisting it, and you get frustrated. So literally, this cold, rational fact gets tainted with your frustration. And when it's communicated, because this is it's a barometer of affect, of emotion, this will make him feel more dysregulated and shut down his cortex so that you just will not be able to get the point across. He won't understand why it's important. He'll just know that you're mad at me. Why are you mad at me? I'm not mad at you. I just want you to don't get cavities. Cavities are bad for you. Look at this picture this guy's got. No teeth. Look at that. He didn't brush his teeth. And so we're not communicating. And so this is one of the biggest things with both with teachers, with parents, is self-care. If you're regulated, you can actually calm your child down. They will come to your regulatory state if you can stay there. But if you start to get frustrated, you start to co-dysregulate each other. And this happens all the time in classrooms. This happens in all kinds of interactions. I think I have a little drawing about it. But what you described with your children, I think, is such a classic thing for many, many parents, is that they have kids that have completely different styles of, regulating themselves and different interests. And we have 5 kids. They're all grown. I have 3 grandkids. Our first child was one of these kids that was like whatever, I don't know what happened, but he was incredibly well regulated. And we would just tell him to do something, and he'd just do it. It's like, God, we're the best parents. We thought, oh yeah, we got this down. We'd see people in the restaurant with unruly kids. They don't know how to parent. And then we had our daughter, the second child, who was basically Satan's spawn. She was horrible. I mean, she was so dysregulated. And she taught us more about parenting, but it was just completely different baselines. And, I just have to laugh at we were so stupid. We were so full of ourselves. But, we're really good parents. No, we weren't. We were not good parents. But this is the kind of thing that happens a lot with, you'll have an adult who's sort of a little bit, long day. You have a kid that's a little tuned up. You ask them to do something, they don't do it. You raise your voice. When's the last time when somebody reminded you to do something that it actually made you feel regulated? Like, oh, honey, thank you so much for telling me to take out the garbage. Oh, that really makes me feel regulated. It's like, it dysregulates you. So when you tell your child, have you done your homework, or do this or do that, it stirs them up. And we end up in these co-dysregulating interactions. And so if you as the adult can start from a lower point and use rhythm, which I haven't really talked about that, but there are ways to interact with folks that are rhythmic, that you start out more parallel as opposed to face-to-face. You use a little bit of rhythm in your voice. You use proximity. You're a little bit more patient. It's so funny that we have these odd ideas that when we ask a child to do something, we somehow have this fantasy that they're supposed to comply immediately. And I think about, like, when I come back from a vacation or something and people want, can we do this, can we do this, can we do this? We got to respond to this. First thing I do is go, oh, I need to compose myself, and here, give me all those messages, I'm going back to my office, leave me alone. Very rarely when we tell these kids, Billy, I want you to do this or this. Billy, I told you to put your book down. We told you to put your book down. Billy's going, ugh. He doesn't go, teacher, just give me a minute. I got to pull myself together. I'll get to it. Listen, just give me a couple minutes to kind of sort myself here. We never do that. We're like, we expect you to, be compliant. Anyway. Sorry. I go off on tangents. Yes, question?
what are your thoughts on, like, tiger parenting? kind of that.
You know,
the
here's
benefit to the,
here's what I think. I think, and this is not meant to be a cop-out answer, but one of the things that we've learned is that there are many ways to be a family that are healthy, that lead to good outcomes. And there are cultural differences in the way people do parenting and child rearing. There are culture differences in the way, and family differences in what they emphasize and think is important as opposed to other families. And I think it's always a mistake for us to sort of, you know, there are certain fundamental things that we think are essential to a healthy parenting and family setting. But if you've got those things met, you can have a whole range of other things that you can incorporate into parenting. And so I'm not necessarily opposed to that kind of parenting where there's high expectations and there's lots of structure and there's pushing. But what they're going to run into, tiger parents are going to run into what all parents run into. You will stretch the limits of some kids and it's not going to work. And then there will be other kids who are highly adaptable and for whatever reason, like if my oldest son, if we tiger parented my oldest son, he probably would have done fine. If we would have tried to tiger parent my second child, it would have been a frickin' disaster. And so that's kind of my response, is that I think that we have to become a little bit more developmentally informed as a society and you know, be capable of demonstrating the flexibility that matches the needs of the child in ways that can help them find their niche and their strengths and end up being happy, productive, contributing citizens. So, yes.
So thinking about what you were saying earlier about the importance of play and thinking about schools, and especially schools that have come from poverty and many other factors, if you were going to do like 2 or 3 things in a school to help build in more play, what would it be?
Well, we actually are doing that. I mean, we work with schools all over the world, and some of them in very, very challenging communities, including Compton. We have a big project in Franklin County where a lot of the inner city schools in Columbus are struggling, and one of the first things that we did that was incredibly effective, way more effective than I thought, is just teaching the teachers about these concepts. And then watching how they take these ideas and use their creativity to do all kinds of amazing stuff. So, look, for example, in Franklin County, we went in, we did a little bit of teaching about state-dependent functioning, about what happens with exposure to trauma, the impact of sort of chaos on development, and a little bit about how regulation works. And one of the big things about regulation, and I didn't talk about it too much, though, is that one of the most powerful fundamental ways for us to get regulated is to, first of all, you have to get to those systems that are involved in stress and dysregulation. And as you saw, the most direct route was through your somato, body and sensory routes. That's how you directly get to that part of the brain, which means that that's the pathway. But the pattern is important, and the pattern that's important is derived from rhythms that were created in utero. So in utero, remember how I saw those, I showed that stuff? In the developing fetal body, you're getting all this feedback from your fetal body that says, I'm not hungry, I'm not thirsty, I'm not cold, and all that's going in, and it's going into the lower parts of the brain, and then you're getting all this, trying to get this slide up here if I have it, and you're getting all this feedback, you know, from all this neuronal activity that's coming in through maternal heart rate. Non-stop. Non-stop. The entire time you're developing in utero is this rhythm. And it's a syncopated rhythm, you know, depending upon mom's heart rate, but it's roughly between 64 to 80 beats per minute. And then all the syncopated rhythms that go with that. And so what happens is your brain connects patterned, repetitive, somatosensory activity that's in those rhythms with being regulated. And so when you take a little 3-year-old boy, trying to teach him how to be, use the toilet. And he starts to get a full bladder, and he gets a signal down here that, hey, this is distressing, you gotta go. What does he do? He rocks. Now, there's no physiological connection between rocking and your bladder. He's rocking because he's dysregulated. And so he'll rock, he'll keep playing his Legos because he doesn't want to stop playing Legos because why? It's fun. What did I say earlier? Repetition, repetition, repetition. Play is the glue that makes you repeat things, which gets stuff into your head. But he's pleasure, 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 distress, distress, distress. And then all of a sudden distress is a little more than pleasure, and I gotta go. And he goes really fast and it's all over the bathroom. And of course, it's my fault. Teach him how to go, and honey, I did. Anyway. But all of us use pattern, repetitive, rhythmic stuff to regulate. We run, music, dance, all of these things. Pattern, repetitive, rhythmic stuff. It's time to stop, right?
No, I hate to stop
Well,
this.
so we teach the teachers about this stuff. We teach them about sensory breaks. And they use pattern, repetitive, rhythmic stuff in the class. In both as a vehicle to teach content, like math, hip-hop with math, and we like both, they have little 3 or 4 minute long sensory breaks every 20 minutes. And that literally leads to astounding changes in outcomes. So.
Right, well, Dr. Curry, again, thank you so much. This
You're
has
welcome.
been